Good morning. I would like to call the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll.
Senator Saslaw. Here. Senator Normant. Senator Here. Hanger. He is. Senator Hanger is here. Senator Lucas.
Here.
Senator Newman. Here. Senator Ruff. Here. Senator Vogel.
Here.
Senator Barker. Here. Senator Edwards. Here. Senator Deeds. Here. Senator Locke. Senator Peterson. Here. Senator Marsden. Here. Senator Eben. Here. Senator McClellan. And Senator Howe.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Hobie. This morning, I'm bringing before you a package of amendments that was crafted in an effort to maintain structural balance while also restoring a limited number of priorities from the budget that we originally adopted last March. In March, I told you that the budget was focused on Virginia's future and prioritizes the people of Virginia. This package of amendments still prioritizes the people of Virginia, and the recommendations are made with a focus on continuing to equalize that with the need for a structural balance. The majority of the items proposed today are restoring initiatives that were unallotted or eliminated by the governor. In order to do this in a fiscally responsible way, staff was asked to find additional savings, and they will cover those items in their presentation later this morning. We are also not recommending using any of our reserves at this time in order to protect our AAA bond rating. I'll remind the members that $900 million in planned deposits to our reserves have already been redirected to balance the budget. Now let me highlight some of the items that prioritize the people of Virginia. In Health and Human Resources, the amendments make significant investments in community-based behavioral health services, including crisis services and permanent supportive housing. It restores some rate increases for developmental disability waiver providers and skilled and private duty nursing services. It institutes a Medicaid adult dental benefit starting in July of 2021 and provides limited overtime for personal care attendants starting in January of 2021. It also addresses other high priority needs. The amendments also make investments related to criminal justice reform. The package of legislation that passed the Senate has been funded as part of these amendments. Funded items include policing reform provisions from Senator Locke's bill, compassionate release and earned sentence credits, a mental health awareness response system, expungements, and grant funding for body-worn cameras. As we move forward with reform, however, I do want to reiterate the support and appreciation that we feel for those serving in law enforcement. To that end, the amendments include a $500 bonus on December 1st of this year for state and state-supported local law enforcement and supplemental funding that would provide the same $500 per law enforcement officer for localities that receive 599 funding. Additionally, I want to mention that the amendments stipulate some spending under the federal coronavirus relief funds, and if revenues improve, some contingent funding. Under contingent items, the amendments would propose some additional funding for initiatives in health and human resources, K-12, and a 2% bonus for state and state-supported local employees and teachers. I reiterate, that is contingent on having additional funding. I'm going to end by saying this budget is still a great budget for the people of Virginia. I want to thank members of our staff who have worked overtime all night for days and assisted us tremendously. And I look forward to us adopting our amendments today. Now the staff will give us an overview of the budget.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll start with our PowerPoint presentation, and we'll turn to slide 2. I will cover the first set of the slides very quickly, as you've seen most of these before, but I wanted to give you a reminder of the starting place and what happened with the budget that the governor sent down on August the 18th. So on slide 2, just a reminder that your session Senate budget priorities had to do with, as the chair stated, investments in the people of Virginia, and that was a number of things under education, including such things as SOQ rebenchmarking, need-based aid, community college workforce programs, and health and human resources. This had to do with fully funding the Medicaid forecast and enhancing provider rates and waiver slots, and additional funding for permanent supportive housing. In employee compensation, you were focused on providing compensation for all the various groups. There was changes in transportation and infrastructure funding, and natural resources, also some significant investments. This was also done while also prioritizing structural balance, and initially that meant putting cash capital outlay into maintenance reserve, doing some rainy day fund and reserve deposits, and funding a lot of one-time items in 20 or the first year of the biennium, and doing some additional things like repaying VRS teacher plan rates early from that deferred payment. If you turn to slide 3, I'll just reiterate that the current economic environment has been challenging. We're still seeing financial impacts of COVID-19, even though they're not fully known at this time, and that will continue to be in flux. You might remember the administration back in April anticipated that revenues would decline by approximately $1 billion in each fiscal year, and the collections that ended the fiscal year that closed for 2020 had the forecast. We were behind the forecast about $234 million. There was changes to the forecast through the traditional reforecast process that was done by the Advisory Board of Economists and the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates, and those were done in late July, early August. Therefore, the governor introduced his budget on August the 18th with general fund resources down by $2.5 billion for the biennium. On slide 4, this is just a reminder of some of those general fund appropriation actions that were taken at reconvened. The chair mentioned the reductions in planned reserve deposits. That was a little over $601 million in the fiscal year 2020, and that also was a $300 million deposit that wasn't done in the current biennium that was part of the unallotments. And so again, this slide is just a reminder, and you've seen it before, so we'll move to slide 5. This is just a summary of the way the governor's budget came to you in August, and there's a restatement of what the savings were, some technical spending, including Medicaid enrollment, Revenue Stabilization Fund deposit, and WQIF. There were some technical changes to that, and I'll cover that in a minute. There was also some additional policy spending, which has been summarized here. If you turn to slide 6, these are just bullets on some of those points. Just a reminder that the unallotments totaled about $75 million in 2021 and about $45 million in 2022. Those were the restoration of the one-time amendment initiatives that had been unallotted. There was also some restoration of cultural initiatives of $9.61 million in 2021 and restoration of funding for historically black colleges and universities, and those are listed here in the bullet. There was also some funding in the introduced budget, which is important to note because we're going to add to it in the Senate amendments, for the criminal justice reform and policing initiatives that were in the introduced budget. It was $2.61 million in 21 and $1 million in 22. There was some funding for elections for the prepaid postage for absentee ballots of $2 million. That will be reduced in this committee actions, as that has already passed in what is now Chapter 1, which is the Senator Howe's bill that has already been signed into law. And then there was some appropriations under TANF for various food security actions. And lastly, there was various language amendments related to eviction, utility disconnection moratoriums, election policy changes, and other things in natural resources and transportation. Though I will note the amendments related to eviction and utilities have been altered, and you will see those in the packet of amendments. Moving on to slide 7, this is just a summary of the tax policy actions. I won't reiterate that, but it's here for your benefit. Slide 8, I mentioned the totals for the restoration of unallotments from the governors, and these are summarized here, but there's some additional funding for things such as the broadband, housing, trust fund, dam rehabilitation, some support for the Virginia Jobs Investment Program, some additional funding for the eviction prevention and diversion pilot program, some money for offshore wind, some additional money for early childhood educators, and a few others. Moving on to slide 9, this is just a summary of those cultural initiatives I mentioned earlier. All in the first year, they total to $9.6 million. And I won't cover that in detail since we've done it before. Slide 10 just shows you, based on the current actions, what's currently in reserves between the Revenue Reserve Fund and the Revenue Stabilization Fund. That totals to a little over $1.1 billion estimated. Moving on to slide 11. This summarizes the Coronavirus Relief Fund commitments and things that were under review. I'll just have this here for your knowledge, so that later we'll cover some additional things that were done in one of the committee amendments. Moving on to slide 12, again, I'll mention that the economic situation remains unclear as the pandemic continues. We do have some thoughts that Medicaid spending could add additional pressure on the state budget as caseload is higher due to the required federal maintenance of eligibility requirement to receive that enhanced federal match rate, which that portion is beneficial to the state. Also, sometimes some of the effects of unemployment have not yet shown up, and the utilization of certain services has declined in COVID-19, and so those things are in flux as well. There's also some additional, funding needed, hopefully under the Coronavirus Relief Fund, to get towards some of our things related to testing, childcare, and housing. Previously, I had mentioned that the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, and we heard from VEC previously that it's expected to be at a record deficit. That's also covered in one of the Senate Committee amendments, Senate Finance Committee and Appropriations amendments. And then there's still the looming question, though it seems to be trending more negative now, about whether additional federal stimulus funding would be provided. And likely flexibility at this point would be helpful, but also looks more negative. Turning to slide 13, this is the sort of the summary of the changes to the general fund resources. And there's, if you look at the last column on the right, this is what the changes to what the governor introduced plus the committee amendments. And here's where I'm going to talk about the unappropriated balance, or what was left and not spent in the governor's introduced budget. You'll note here at the bottom that the governor's budget came over the way it was stated at about $525 million with unappropriated balance. But once we do some of those technical amendments that then would match back to the Secretary of Finance and Director of Department and Planning Budget's presentation that they did for you, those actions that needed to be done based on some funding that should have originally gone to the healthcare fund, and then the reversion back of some of the spending related to the WQIF Part B payment, that really brings it down to $490.5 million. And you might remember I've mentioned that as sort of the starting place of the unappropriated balance, as the way that the introduced budget was intended to come to us. So as we think about the budget as it came to us with those technical changes, it's $490.5 million for the unappropriated balance. You'll see that the committee amendments, based on the direction of the chair, that we find saving strategies to cover most of the spending. You'll see that the Senate committee amendments, when added to those actions, is very close to that $490.5 million. It's actually about $8.8 million different. And so the unappropriated balance in the packet of amendments that you have today is $481.7 million. So turning to slide 14, the amendment package has a limited number of changes to those from the introduced budget, and I'm going to give you a high-level summary. The additional general fund spending, which the majority of which were restorations of funding to those things that were unallotted back to the original budget, total about $222 million. There's some offsetting savings of about $217.2 million, so you see very close to that number. One of the amendments allocates some of the remaining federal coronavirus relief or federal funds. There is an item that has spending contingent on an additional revenue, and we'll cover that more fully on a coming slide. And then there's some language-only amendments and some technical amendments that were needed. And There's some additional detail if you want to go back and look at our previous presentation that was much longer for the introduced budget from the August 24th presentation. So moving to slide 15, I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike because a number of the items were related to spending in the Health and Human Resources area, and he's going to quickly cover slide 15.
So on slide 15, what you can see is all the general fund spending amendments for HHR. So I won't go over them line by line. Many of them should be familiar to you because they were approved back in the regular session and then unallotted and subsequently eliminated in the governor's introduced budget for the special session. So I'll just touch on the highlights, but you can see it's about $124 million in HHR. A significant chunk of that, of about over $45 million, is actually related to mental health. So those are some of the numbers you see near the bottom of the table related to statewide discharge assistance plans, pilot programs for facility census reduction. These were initiatives to try to get at the census problems that the state mental health hospitals are having, which has been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other things related to STEP Virginia and funding the crisis services portion of STEP Virginia, and then permanent supportive housing, which is another major initiative for mental health. Other things that were included was Medicaid provider rates. One of the more critical ones is the developmental disability waiver rates. So what the committee amendments do is starting July 1st of next year, they fund half of the increase that was included in the approved last session. The other half will actually be a contingent appropriation, which will be discussed on later slides. That was the more critical waiver thing, provider rate. So just some of the other policy changes is the adding the Medicaid adult dental benefit, which would start July 1st of next year, providing 8 hours of overtime for personal care attendants starting January 1st that's coming up. Extending the famous MOMS program, which provides pregnant women coverage for pregnant women, extending the postpartum coverage from 2 to 12 months. That would start January 1st as well. And then the other one I would just note is the elimination of the 40-quarter work requirement for legal permanent residents, which would begin July 1st of next year. So with that, and you can see the rest of the HHR ones there, I'll turn it back over to April to cover other general fund spending.
Thank you, Mike. Turning to the next slide, slide 16, I'm just going to quickly cover a few of these. The majority of these on the page, again, are restoring unallotments. So I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but you'll see some of the biggest ones are restoration of funding for George Mason and Old Dominion universities for their enrollment funding that had been in the conference report. I will mention that first year amount is prorated, since by the time the budget passed, it'll be a partial year. Some other things on here, there are some, again, restorations in under the Department of Criminal Justice Services for pretrial, local pretrial and probation services, pre and post incarceration services, and some other things. There's some additional funding for under the General District Courts for clerk positions and an additional judgeship in the 19th District. There's additional funding for public defenders. Two items of note are actually not restorations. One, there's additional staffing at the Virginia Employment Commission and general fund dollars to actually help them through this period of time where they need perhaps some additional support, with the hopes that that will also give them some additional capacity to respond to member requests and public requests as well. And the biggest item of note I'll mention is toward the bottom there. There's that $500 bonus for state and state-supported local sworn law enforcement, and that's $18.4 million, and that back to what the chair referred to earlier. So you see the summary there. That turns us to slide 17. On this slide, you see the general fund impact of the various pieces of legislation that have passed the Senate so far, and what has been picked up related to that, much of which is related to the criminal justice reform package. You'll see a number of those for the mental health awareness response system, compassionate medical release, earned sentence credits, policing reform, the patterns and practices investigations under the Attorney General's office, expungement, and then at the bottom there's some additional funding related to body-worn cameras, in the most of which is grant funding in the first year that requires a 50% local match. That turns us to slide 18, and this is where we're going to cover the additional savings strategies that the staff came up with. And I'm going to turn it back to Mike to cover those first couple of savings strategies.
So with regard to savings, what you will see is the first three lines is related to the Medicaid managed care rate. So effective July 1st of this year, there was a rate reduction of about 5% in the children's managed care program, and then a slight reduction in the other long-term care program. So those first three actually capture, that's the most significant part of the savings, and that flows through the biennium. And the fourth item there is related to waiver slots in the second year of the biennium. This basically takes the funding for 350 of them and diverts them to help fund the DD provider rates, or the development disability provider rates that you already saw in the general fund spending. And then later you'll see in one of the contingent actions that would restore all the waiver slots that were removed from the budget that was previously approved in the regular session if revenues are sufficient to cover those. I'll turn it back over to April.
Thank you, Mike. I'll pick up with, if you look in the middle there with ABC, there's some additional capturing of net profits, estimates of what we think are going to be the above target revenues, 3.3 in the first year, 3.4 in the second year. The next one has to do, you might have heard that the Rolls-Royce plant is closing. These were the performance grants related to that were scheduled to be paid, so we would take that back. And the next line is related to that, which would be a transfer back, which would have been part of the incentive package there. The next item has to do with the prediction that since a number of healthcare services haven't been accessed at the same rate, that the premiums would not go up. And so there's a 20.6 million savings there. And there's $50 million that had been provided previously with general funds for matching funds related to COVID-19. Of that 50, this is a reversion of 30 million, as we think the coronavirus relief funds and other testing funds will be sufficient for that purpose. And then the last item is an item that was included in the introduced budget but didn't have any revenue pickup, and so we would have an estimate of what that action would give us there. And so that completes slide 18. Those are, again, the additional savings. Slide 19 has the non-general fund only spending items, the biggest of which has to relates to the gray machine funding, which is one-time funding. Since the impact to the reduction in sales tax is going to be very large on local school divisions, this is a one-time payment to help them with those actions. And again, it's related to the gray machine funding. It is tied to that and whether or not we would collect that amount. The next couple of items are related to TANF, and one is for Portsmouth, for the Volunteers for the Homeless, the Minchville House, the Family Restoration Services of Hampton, and Cornerstones. So that's the total for the non-general fund only spending items. Moving to slide 20, there is a committee amendment that does a number of things related to the federal coronavirus relief funds. You might remember in the reconvened session, you gave authority for the governor to spend those items. This amendment does a few things. One, it allocates what the governor currently has already done in fiscal year 20 and 21, so it's for your reference in a table, so you can refer back to that. In higher education, there's a paragraph that stipulates $65 million will go to higher education for various other things, including there's two small capital projects, one at UVA and one at VCU, I believe. The next one is related to K-12. You might mention Secretary Lane had mentioned the $200 million that would go back per pupil, and that's put in a paragraph as well. There's a modification of the nursing home language related to the CRF allocations that we hope will allow greater access to those funds. There's some additional funding to provide assistance to the developmental disability waiver providers at $40 million, child care stabilization grants at $20 million, hazard pay, hope for personal care workers if they can find out a way to do it for up to 3 months, or potentially a one-time payment with that 34, $15 million for tourism and recreation industries, and
Madam
then
Chair.
25.5 for PPE and
Madam
COVID
Chair.
expenses.
Senator Peterson.
Yeah, I'm going to walk backwards and sort of poke into a couple of these numbers. First, hazard pay for personal care workers. Now, is that it's getting paid through Medicaid reimbursement, or is it getting paid to the MCOs? How exactly is that distributed?
Madam Chair, Senator Peterson, so that's actually one of the things that they're working on. Certainly, since long-term care has moved into managed care, they would have to work through the managed care companies. There are other options something that the administration has been looking at. So the language actually provides them with flexibility to figure out the best way to do it. Maybe it could be done through a one-time payment, but yes, they would need to work with the managed care companies to make it work.
Right, and if I might, Madam Chair, I guess my goal would be I want to make sure this actually flows through to the personal care workers, because obviously they're working at an hourly wage, maybe 15, 16 bucks an hour, or likely less in other parts of the state. So I just want to make sure that flows through. Another follow-up question, Madam Chair, if I might. The support for tourism and recreation, how is that being distributed?
Madam Chair, Senator Peterson, the way that the amendment is written is to allow a lot of flexibility for the governor's office to find a way to distribute that. It's unclear, but we wanted to put something out there that would help those businesses that have been perhaps most directly impacted and closed. And so this particular amendment, and I'm going to tell you which one it is so you can look in the packet, is 479.10 number 1S. It starts on page 126. So it still retains a number of a lot of flexibility for the administration to implement this. And if some of those things aren't doable, to reallocate that. And I will say there's guidance there that says, of funds remaining to go back and backfill the unemployment trust fund. One other thing that it does that I do want to mention, it creates a joint subcommittee of the members, a sort of a subset of House Appropriations and House and Senate Finance Appropriation Committees to sort of review the number of things, even though there's not a lot of time left between now and December. But it does that so they can work with the governor. And when allocations are made, there's notifications to those committees as well. So those are sort of the main things. But again, it gives it still a lot of flexibility on the executive side, because we know the guidance from federal U.S. Treasury is ever changing. So it's, again, the governor does need some flexibility on those. So that's just almost $400 million of what's left that the amendment refers to, and that finishes up slide 20. Moving on to slide 21. Here are the items that would be contingent on additional revenue, and this is the listing by priority order. So you'll see a number of things are related to the Health and Human Resources area. Again, additional funding for permanent supportive housing, additional partial implementation of STEP Virginia, mental health provider rates, enhancing behavioral health services. There's a few in K-12, which includes additional support for at-risk students, some maximizing pre-kindergarten access for at-risk 3 and 4-year-olds. Back to HHR, DD waiver provider rates, additional funding there, and same with the next one, increased rates for skilled and private duty nursing services. There's additional funding for more hours of overtime for personal care attendants, increasing rate for psychiatric residential treatment facilities, then restoring development disability waiver slots, funds for home visiting services, funds for local Department of Social Services prevention services. At DOC, the additional funding related to electronic health records, there was some restoration earlier of $3 million in each year for that one. This is on top of that. Increasing Medicaid nursing facility reimbursement. And then the last item there is a contingent 2% bonus for state employees, teachers, and state-supported locals. And those contingent items, if there were additional revenue, total to $373.5 million. That completes slide 21. So moving on to slide 22. I won't cover these in great detail, but this is just a listing of some of the language amendments, a number referred to DMV, some changes removing the tipping fee in natural resources, some more technical things, rail to trail authorization, changes to the nutrient credit study. There is an amendment here to allow some additional flexibility. As you know, we're required to do budget public hearings, and it would allow for virtual hearing this year, on top of the language that you previously adopted, just so that's more clear. Some language related to private day special education, nursing home priority testing, some more technical ones. And then I mentioned previously that there had been some updates or changes to the utilities moratorium language, the eviction moratorium language. Redistricting commission implementation language has been added to the packet. The COVID-19 Relief Fund Authority relates back to the spending of the gray machine money that we talked about earlier. There's an amendment that would provide temporary flexibility in higher education to allow for some support of auxiliary programs. Normally, we don't allow some cross support between the education in general and academic side to the auxiliary, but that would allow that. And then there's an amendment that related to the STARS under the state police, their procurement, and restricting that further until some reporting. That gets us to slide 23, and then this is just a listing of some technical amendments, some of which relate to just with supplementing capital construction pools, allowing that. Some language related to the autism pass-through. Under DGS, some funding, not funding, the language, there was language in two different places that made it unclear, and this would fix that. And then lastly, under direct aid, there's some clarifying language related to dual enrollment tuition scholarship grants. And Madam Chair, that completes the staff's presentation.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for staff?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Senator Evan.
I have two areas I wanted to ask about. One is about the heated tobacco products tax that's listed at 2.25 cents per stick rather than a milliliter or a percentage tax. Could you just explain that to me, how that's going to be assessed, and if that's, is that the same thing as e-cigarettes? Is that what you're referring to?
Madam Chair, I'm going to ask Charles Kennington on staff to clarify that earlier for Senator Eben.
Charles.
Thank you, April. Madam Chair, the tax would apply to heated tobacco products, not liquid nicotine. If you recall that the liquid nicotine tax was imposed previously, this would be a new item on heat not burn products, which are similar to a cigarette in that it comes in a stick, is not in a liquid nicotine form.
So just to follow up, what is the, if you could just for my clarification, remind me what a heated tobacco product is?
So the most common one, Madam Chair, is called, I believe it's called IQOS. What happens is the device heats the tobacco but doesn't burn it.
I see. And the other question, Madam Chair, has to do with the tipping fee. It says remove the tipping fee. Is the tipping fee deal with dumping of trash? Is that what that is?
Madam Chair, it does, but I would ask Jason Powell to further clarify for Senator Eben. He's also on the Zoom.
Thank you, April. Madam Chair, Senator Eben. The introduced budget had proposed a study by the Secretary of Natural Resources and the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry to impose a tipping fee, yes, on the landfilling of waste because it was so broad and was language that could be accomplished by the administration without direction from the General Assembly. The recommendation of the committee is to strike that language.
Thank you.
Are there further questions? I don't see any, so I would like to again thank our absolutely spectacular staff. They have been working so hard. I think the ones that have had the biggest burden are April and Mike, but all members of the staff have been just so responsive and helpful, so thank you all. Is there a motion on the budget?
I would move
What?
Madam Chair.
What? Hold on. Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Peterson.
So this is to report the budget?
Yes.
Okay, I definitely have some questions then.
Okay.
All right. And I know I've had this conversation with Senator Barker over the last couple of days, but the language we have in here on the rental moratorium, which is page, I'll direct it to your attention. It's on page 175, item 4-14, number 1. And before I ask a question, Madam Chair, let me just sort of explain how landlord-tenant contracts work. This has broad language basically saying that you cannot seek to terminate a residential tenancy until after January 31, 2021. If you have a residential lease with somebody and they default on it, or they're late in paying their rent, typically you'll send a default letter, and then you'll eventually make a decision to terminate the lease, which in almost most cases, and certainly in the default rules, a 30-day notice. Once that occurs, you will then file an action in General District Court to take back possession. You'll typically get a hearing date within 30 to 60 days. You may get a trial 30 days after that, but that's typically a 2 to 3 month process before you get an order of possession. All that happens before you seek the writ of possession. Currently, the Supreme Court has said they will not allow courts to issue writs of possession. So in other words, all the steps up to then have been legal, and landlords have been doing that, but they have been unable to get a writ of possession. And in some cases, it's superfluous because the family moves out. But in other cases, they want to take back the property. They're getting no rental revenue, but they're not able to obtain the writ of possession, which is when the sheriff actually executes on the property. The reason why I'm saying this is the language we have in here now talks about no landlord shall terminate a residential tenancy, which would basically walk us backwards to a restriction we haven't had since March when this whole thing began, and essentially would mean that you could not get somebody out of a premises until literally it could be 6 months after January of 2021, which I don't think was the intent. I think the intent was to keep it so that the court would not issue a writ of execution or a writ of eviction, what they call here. So I think it's important to be very precise on this language, and I'm not comfortable with this language right as it's written right now. I know Senator Barker and I have had many conversations about this, but I want to raise that, and if we can get a response from staff or as I said, Senator Barker and I.
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
Senator Barker.
Yes, Senator Peterson, Madam Chair. After a conversation with Senator Peterson, we did address language in here in 3 different places and there was language said that a landlord could not take any action, which would basically mean you would have to start at the beginning after January 31. And for example, on the 4th line down on 8A, it says, or seek a writ of eviction. And that was the language that was put in there in place of what had been take any action. So it would allow, as my understanding is, the intent clearly was to allow the steps that would be necessary, but not allow the writ of eviction until after January 31 of 2021. There are 2 other places where that same language is used in here. And if there's further clarification that needs to occur to make it clear for the courts, we certainly could address that through the conference committee.
Well, Madam Chair, for
Senator Peterson.
And I appreciate Senator Barker, and we did talk about this yesterday. The language right now says no landlord shall terminate a residential tenancy or seek a writ of eviction. My understanding was it was just going to refer to writ of eviction. People have been terminating tenancies right and left since March or April. I don't even know if that would be a valid act anymore under this language. I think what we want to say is that the court shall not issue a writ of eviction. Telling people what they can or cannot do under their own residential lease, to me, is, first of all, it's a violation of Article 1, Section 11 of our own Constitution. But more critically, if we're going to be consistent with what we've had up till now, it would be the court should not issue a writ of execution. So, and I apologize, this may seem like a picayune point, but precision is very important here because you have thousands of small landlords that are unable to take back their property and may not have the CPA that would, allow them to very easily recover these costs. And we're going to put them in an impossible situation if we don't get this exactly correct.
Staff has pointed out to me that the proper motion we should have had was to adopt the amendments rather than to report the budget. So if there's no objection, we will just rescind the motion to report And I'm open to another motion to adopt the amendments. The amendments.
Madam Chair.
It's been moved and seconded.
Madam Chair.
That they be adopted. Senator Peterson, so you have some options here. The one that I would suggest is a floor amendment. I'm sure we're going to be having floor amendments.
And Madam Chair, I think we're all on the same page, and again, I discussed this with Senator Barker last night, and the disadvantage of not seeing the actual language till right now. I think a floor amendment would be precise, but I did want to point that out because this is a very important provision, and I appreciate everyone working together here. I know what we're trying to do, but the language has to be correct, so thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?
Madam Chair.
Senator Newman.
Madam Chair, I guess to staff, when you look at what we're calling the language amendment from the McClellan bill, were there any changes to that would take out municipals like the bill did with the McClellan version and fix the co-op problem like the McClellan bill did? In other words, does it track the McClellan bill, or is it more like what we had seen before?
April.
Madam Chair, I was going to say I would ask either Senator Barker or Adam to respond to that question.
Madam Chair.
Senator Barker.
Madam Chair and Senator Newman, this language is broader than what was in the McClellan and does bring in for the payment plan provisions the municipals in this process. It does allow an exception if the outstanding amount that's owed collectively is more than 1% of the annual income of the entity, that they would not have to comply beyond that level.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I believe, have the motion to adopt the amendments.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator
Before
Newman.
we do that, could I just speak to the motion?
Yes.
Madam Chair, first, I just think this process has been done very, very well. I'm very pleased that the chair and the staff have really put together a budget that tries to really in a thoughtful way fix the problems that we endured when we left last. The other thing, Madam Chair, is that working with your staff, the structural balance of this is pretty extraordinary. One, because they have found the $200 million in savings and a lot of good things in here, including the DD waivers and the $500 bonus for law enforcement. I think that sends an important message. The $6 million for body cameras, the new VEC constituent service items, and just the attempt to try to do something with state employees and teachers. Madam Chair, I think the nursing home testing was very helpful. Redistricting Commission shares the Senate position from Senator Locke and Lucas and others. I think the STARS is an important item. And the other, when you listen this morning to what this House of Delegates did, this is just a vastly superior budget. Madam Chair, the difficulty that I've been wrestling with is balancing those against a number of the bills that are required to be in this budget that I very much did not support. And there are many. I did not think that the landlord portion would land the way it has. Hopefully, Senator Peterson can fix that. I was hoping that we would deal with the disconnect way in the way that Senator McClellan, I think, very thoughtfully did that. And Madam Chair, as you know, what we're going to vote on soon is not just these amendments, but the governor sent down the budget, and there are some items that came through in the conference committee report as it related to some of the funding of Planned Parenthood and otherwise that give me pause. So, Madam Chair, you have run a tremendous process. There's a lot of good here. The comparison to the House budget is much in the Senate's favor. But until and unless there are some changes on the floor, I will not be able to support the legislation, as I told you the last couple of days, but I'm very grateful to the process and to the staff and to the extraordinary work in much of the bill. So, Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Senator Newman. Okay, we have
Madam Chair.
Senator Hanger.
Senator Hanger.
Is that Senator Hanger trying to get attention?
Yes, I must
Okay.
have gone to a bad spot here. Can you hear me now?
Barely.
Okay, I have some comments similar to Senator Newman's, except I do intend to support this, but there are probably 3 or 4 provisions that are in it, in some language aligned with some of the bills that I would hope we can address on the floor. Certainly the eviction legislation that we're looking at is one of them. So I'm going to go ahead and vote for this because I think it's a good work product. But I would hope that we would address a few tweaks on the floor as this moves along rather than waiting for conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hanger. This is a long process, and this is one of the first steps. So,
Madam Chair.
Senator Vogel.
Thank you. I feel like Oz talking into the room. I just wanted to say, I too very much want to support this budget. We've waited a long time to get here, and I know that the Finance Committee has done a lot of work. Like some of my colleagues, there are lots of things in the budget that I didn't support and voted against on the floor. But I just want to say, so that I'm on the record, those pieces I've voted against, but for purposes of the budget, I very, very much want to support an overall budget and will vote for the bill for that reason. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of the public who may not be aware of this technicality, if a bill passes the Senate, we have to fund it in our budget.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Deeds.
If I could just state that while I intend to vote on this bill as a whole, I want to abstain from item 414.2S.
The clerk will note that. Any other comments? Okay, the motion before us is to adopt the amendments to the Senate bill. All in favor? No, it's for the amendments. This is on the amendments, so all in favor of the amendments, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Any opposed? And those will be noted. And there are 2 noes. So the amendments are agreed to. Is there a motion to, it's been moved and seconded that the budget bill be reported. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And we'll record those 2 noes. Okay, thank you, committee. And most particularly, thank you, staff. Spectacular job as always. And we will rise.